Hi, I'm Michael Fry, President and CEO of Deepwater Subsea. In this episode of The Daily Grind, I tell you to go find yourself. And I also talk about why training isn't the end-all be-all when it comes to compliance verification. Let's get into the show. So when I talk about going and finding yourself, in a downturn market, something I find that's very interesting is guys are unwilling to go above and beyond what they're being asked to do. So many times when the market was in an upswing and everything was great during the last kind of boom, you could get away with, job hopping and, oh, I'm not going to do that, or I'm going to go chase $1 here, or I'm going to go chase 50 cents there. But in this market today, you have to be willing to do whatever it takes and to get out there and hustle and grind and sometimes, do the dirty work. I was talking to a guy yesterday and we were talking about some different positions that are possibly coming available with Deepwater Subsea, and he was like, I'm not a hands-on guy. I want to be a superintendent. I want to be in the office, and I was like, hey, look, the khaki position isn't available today. You need to be willing to get out and hustle and do whatever it takes. And, my team knows that for me, if a client called today and said, hey, Mike, we want you to go offshore, I'm there because it's whatever it takes. The difference is too many people have put themselves on a pedestal and think they need to stay on top of that pedestal. So when I talk about going and finding yourself, you have to be willing to do whatever it takes. If you look in the mirror and say, oh, I'm not that guy, I'm not willing to do that, then don't bitch and complain because the industry's in a downturn and you can't get a job. Sometimes when the market shifts the way it has, you have to do whatever is required to get back in there and get back into the game. So go find yourself. Take a look in the mirror, go for a walk, really sit back and think, what are you willing to do to get back into the hustle? I've mentioned the story before. I used to hear the old timers, and I say the old timers, the guys who are getting ready for this great crew change that people talk about. Back in the 80s, I went from a rig manager to a roustabout. It was like, holy smokes. Well, that time is here again. You might not go from a rig manager to a roustabout, but you might go from an OIM or a rig, whatever you want to call it, a drill section leader, whatever term your company uses, assistant rig manager, back down to a tool pusher, back down to a driller. I've seen drillers go back to roughnecks, but they were willing to do whatever it took to put food on the table. So go find yourself. Take some time, beginning of 2016, take a look in the mirror, go for a long walk, and think about what are you willing to do to get back into the game. If somebody called you tomorrow or called you today, for an example, and said, hey, look, we have an opportunity for you to go to work, but you're going to be scrubbing toilets. Would you be willing to do that? When my dad lost his job in the 80s or the late 70s, early 80s, you've heard me tell this story in the past. My dad did whatever it took. Picked apples with the migrant workers, worked 2 jobs, worked as a handyman. He did whatever it took to put food on the table. Are you willing to do that in this downturned industry? Something to think about. So Director Salerno's talked about high reliability organizations, and he's referenced the submarine Subsafe culture that the Navy has. What I find interesting is if we're going to push that into oil and gas, there's some things that you need to think about. The submarine Subsafe culture was built around a work discipline, a discipline to the rules and regulations. You hear me talk about before, 100% compliance, 100% of the time. We also talked about material control. You had to use the right parts, new parts, each and every time. We were unable to rebuild a valve or a component unless you had all of the parts readily available before you disassembled it. So if I knew that there was an issue, I had to get all the parts out of the warehouse, get them all together, inventory them, check them, document everything. Then I was allowed to go in and actually do the work. On top of that, we talk about documentation. So the documentation was, this is the work that I'm going to do. Here's the references. Here's the drawings. Here's the steps. I had to write out a procedure for how I was going to go about doing this work. I had to write out a procedure for how I was going to test it, how I was going to torque it, how I was going to verify it. All of this documentation was put into a package that was created before the work got started. The other thing that I think is interesting is we talk about compliance and compliance verification. Today's market, today's industry, Bessie, we have the third-party verifications that take place when the BOP is on deck. That to me is something that's just part of business. That's the way it was when we worked on submarines. it wasn't somebody looking over your shoulder. It was somebody verifying that the work that you did was to 100% standard and it was compliant with the regulations and compliant with the Subsafe kind of culture that we had. The thing that I find interesting is there's so many guys that when a third-party inspector comes on deck, don't get me wrong, there's reasons why some people don't like third-party inspectors. But what's important is if you embrace that third-party inspector and have all of your documentation, have everything ready to go, your life should be a lot easier than trying to fight the system. So if we talk about Subsafe QA, we talk about compliance verification, for me, training at the end of the day is not the answer. A lot of people talk about, oh, if he goes to training, then he's going to be competent. You can be extremely competent and still be extremely lazy. We need to have compliance, we need to have verification with the work that's being done. I'm a firm believer that the Subsafe QA program is a great program to introduce to the oil and gas industry. The problem is the amount of time and the amount of paperwork that would take place prior to doing any work would basically shut the industry down. And the reason I say that is BOP's on deck and I need to tear apart into an annular. That documentation, verification, objective quality, evidence to make sure that you have everything you need. It's the right stuff, right documentation, right drawings, everything's in place. That amount of work would take so much longer than what it takes today that I don't think the industry is ready for it. Now, don't get me wrong, 2 BOP rigs, you have a lot of work that can be done. You can have formal work packages that are already pre-created, but we need to teach the industry how to go about utilizing the Subsafe QA program. For me, at the end of the day, training is not the end-all be-all. Training is great. Training helps develop people, but having highly trained people does not make people, compliant to the regulations. We talk about procedural drift. There's procedures in place, but if no one's watching, the majority of the guys don't follow procedures. The reason is because in their minds, they know what needs to be done. Now that could be true to 75, 80%, but compliance verification will take you to 100%. Documentation. If something happens, can you go back and say, here's the records of everything that we did? Unfortunately, as an industry today, if someone were to go out and do a spot check based off the Navy's QA system, what you would find is a lot of that documentation, quality management, it's just not there. So when Director Salerno talks about going to a Subsafe QA program, something to think about is you can go online today and find a lot of examples of where the Subsafe QA program is in place, documentation-wise. High reliability organizations have it. So when we talk about, the Navy Subsafe program, I saw a presentation that was done by the director to Bessie. And some of the things that I thought was interesting is why does the Navy invest so much into the compliance verification? Well, one of the reasons why is, the consequences of failure are just unacceptable. The last time the Navy lost a U.S. submarine in a non-combat situation was 1968. 1968 is when the Subsafe QA program was implemented. As many times as we do work on the hull valves and we do work on the combat control systems, we've never lost another submarine from that time. And the reason for that is because the verification, the documentation, the quality that goes into the workmanship is much greater than what it was prior to the submarine QA program. The other reason is, an honest mistake can kill you just as much as malpractice. Compliance verification is there for a reason. It's to make sure that the work was done correctly. It was to make sure it's been documented. And there's a separation between the workers and the QA guys who actually are doing the inspection. We had them separated because what was important is if I'm doing the work and I'm QAing myself, how do I know whether or not I'm doing it to the level that needs to be done? It's too easy for me to cut a corner if no one's watching. If I have to do work and I have a QA inspector over my shoulder kind of verifying that everything's been done, then I'm going to be held to a higher standard. And that's something that I think is important as we move forward into 2016 is compliant verification the answer? I think it is in a lot of areas. The problem is as an industry, we need to embrace it instead of pushing back and trying to fight it. It's just something to think about.